should be. We got great people to talk about it. We got Lew Cirne, CEO of New Relic. Fun fact, New Relic is an anagram of Lew Cirne. I never knew that. And we have a Boston fan, Stephen McGrady from RedMonk, and it was, I don't know if you guys are hockey fans, but it was a pretty rough night last night.
Tough night.
So feel sorry for us and be nice. So, the premise of this session is that the app developer is now viewed as a part of the business team, which is great in theory. I still know a couple of developers who still feel like they're kind of kept in the closet and, you know, like mushrooms and fed you know what. But can you talk about how true that is in the bulk of your customer base? I think I can guess what you're going to say.
Well, you know, New Relic is my second company in the space that we're in, which is monitoring software in production. And my first company, by design, we decided to avoid getting stuck in too many conversations with developers because we felt like they just didn't have enough influence on decision making for purchasing technology. And we think that's been turned upside down in the last 10 years because cloud technology, software distribution through SaaS, and dramatic lowering of cost to try out and use technology enables the end user of the technology to actually adopt that technology and spur its utilization internally. And so in our business, that means going to the people who actually are on the front lines keeping software running in production, and that's increasingly the developer. And not worrying about what their boss thinks, because they, you know, the decision making is happening on the front lines, and that's exciting.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the same thing. One of the things that we at RedMonk have been tracking for a long time, obviously, is the rise of the developer and the rise, more importantly, in their sort of preeminence in the decision-making process now. You know, and as Lew says, basically, we're in a world today where developers can obtain software infrastructure, storage, really anything they want, you know, either for free or for pennies on the dollar. And that's the dramatic change from the way that things used to be.
So if a CIO or the corporate masters aren't giving them the tools they need, they're apt to go out and get them themselves.
Well, I mean,
right?
We see this all the time. You know, some of you in the audience may be familiar with the term shadow IT. Right? And shadow IT essentially refers to sort of, well, quote-unquote rogue or independent elements within companies, primarily populated by developers who are basically there to get things done. And a lot of times they're bypassing traditional IT to do that.
I mean, the landscape has changed so much. I've been doing this a really long time, and you know, I covered IBM and Oracle, and you know, things have changed a lot when you had to deploy a big stack. I'm kind of curious, and those companies, IBM anyways, a lot of these companies had their own tool sets for application monitoring. I'm kind of curious about, you know, how they are progressing. Are any of those a factor in this field of mobile application development? I know IBM talks a lot about mobile apps. And I'm just kind of curious, are they catching up, or?
Well, there's certainly always going to be a presence in the market. Companies like IBM and Oracle have an influence, but I think they're really struggling with what's going on today in terms of reaching the customer directly, focusing on, you know, just drop it in and it ought to work, not focusing so much on, you know, on massive deployments at the outset, at the expense of just getting the functionality that serves the business. And they've kind of built a business around, you know, renewals of maintenance on software that they sold 10 years ago, and that's great for the shareholder in the short term. But I think in the long term, more and more businesses are going to be asking, "What have you done for me lately?" on a regular basis. And I think that's why SaaS is interesting, is because we get paid monthly from our customers if we deliver value for them in the last month, and I like being held accountable on that based on the value we deliver them. But if you've built a company for decades where it's more, you know, build it into a lock-in mentality, it's going to be hard to react to that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and I think the evidence is there, right? You know, so in other words, one of the things that we do is go and look at sort of company financials, and one of the things that people come back with, you know, to us, and when we, you know, make the claims that, hey, developers and new Kingmakers and so on, is that, well, hey, Oracle and companies like that are still growing their revenue. And the answer is they are. But in other words, if you go look at and take apart their quarterlies and their end-of-year statements, one of the things you find is that the growth is primarily coming from maintenance agreements, right? You know, the sales, the new licensing sales are mostly flat. They're not growing. And a lot of that comes from the fact that, you know, developers, even if you have a technically superior product, you know, an Oracle database, for example, is sort of functionally more capable than a lot of the open source alternatives, developers more frequently than not are going to choose what's convenient and what's easy to get and what they don't have to jump through a lot of hoops to procure. So that changes the way that these companies function, and the winners are going to be able to complement sort of the existing top-down sales. We know how to sell to CIOs with developer strategies, and thus far the results of that have been very uneven.
Well, when I started out, it was client-server world. Like kind of, you had the LAN, you had the PC, you had the server, and you could troubleshoot those things. Now we're talking about millions of endpoints, be outside the firewall, Amazon, SaaS providers. I mean, how can you monitor the application performance in that environment, which is so distributed?
Our company thinks that the most important stuff to monitor is the software. And so we're a software analytics company, really. And so it's obvious now that software, if 95% of all new software projects the software will be running in one of three places: on the server, in the browser in JavaScript, or in the mobile device. And so we want to, and are present in all of those strategically, because we want to be where the logic is. We think that infrastructure exists to service software projects. And so we just announced a platform initiative yesterday with 40 plugins. But it's interesting, we're not charging for any of the plugins that monitor the infrastructure. That's all free, because we know people need to monitor that, but we think that that's all in service of the important stuff, which is the business logic that the developers wrote. And so we just want to provide a complete solution, but we don't want to be in the business of charging to monitor the network, the database, even though our customers can get it for free. And so it's all part of this whole, we have to be present inside the logic in the mobile device, to see how that's performing, but correlating it with what you see on the server and what you see in the browser.
And that would include like plugins for the big SaaS providers as well?
Yes, absolutely. So some of the plugins we announced yesterday are things like SendGrid and Amazon Web Services, etc. So we're looking at infrastructure as well as services right now, all in one place.
I'm just kind of curious about other tool sets you see out there that let's leave New Relic out. Sure. Maybe Stephen could talk about this, like, new tool sets that you see on the horizon that developers should know about if they don't already.
Well, from a monitoring standpoint, there are any number of tools. You have a lot of open source sort of options available to you. You have a number of software and services-based alternatives to you. The really interesting things to me are going to be sort of the next frontier from a monitoring standpoint isn't just, all right, can you collect what I'm doing? The interesting sort of opportunity for me longer term is going to be, can you collect what I'm doing and compare me to how a much larger population of entities is doing? In other words, this is a Fitbit Flex, right? So it records the things that I'm doing and so on. One of the useful sort of functions it performs is that I can now compare myself to a peer group, I can now compare myself to a baseline and so on. So over time, as we look towards sort of next generation tools, the really interesting sort of opportunities to me are going to lie in the services that allow you to compare against a much larger baseline.
I'm also just interested in how impacted you are with the, like I hear a lot about testing, different Android app implementations. I mean, does that impact you? I mean, there's iOS is one thing, and then there's...
Well, it certainly impacts developers. It's a big headache. Just when we started to see a little bit of settling down on the browsers, and IE it's come a long way recently, there's this plethora of devices in the Android side that just make it that you have no idea if your software is going to work in all those devices. You try and you can throw a lot of money at very complex testing suites, but that can't give you all the assurances in the world that after you've shipped it, it's going to work in, an HTC device running a certain version of the OS in a remote location. So a lot of our customers use our mobile product precisely to manage that risk, and it's only going to increase. Obviously, Android has got the momentum in the marketplace. We don't see that changing, and you're going to just see a proliferation on that QA matrix that requires a depth of monitoring that can cover it all.
If anyone has any questions, you can go up to the mic. I've got more questions here, but don't be shy. We've got the kingpins here. One of the, I'll go on until someone comes up, but one of the stories I've been following is the whole platform as a service story, and there was all of a sudden there was a whole kind of explosion of mobile backends as a service. I'm curious if you think that's going to kind of consolidate and congeal going forward. Is there a need for a mobile backend as a service if there's a PaaS, or any thoughts on that?
You know, honestly, I think the promise to me of platform as a service is, you know, sort of over the longer term, is to basically serve as a container for an application of some kind. Right? The application is going to, you know, present the UI. It's going to have to persist data somewhere. So to the extent that, you know, companies are rolling out hundreds, thousands, you know, of mobile applications a day, sure, sort of enabling that as a service is a useful function. What I think will be a problem for potential adopters is, where do the lines between sort of the you know, sort of plain vanilla platform as a service, where does that end, and the quote unquote sort of mobile backend as a service begin, right? Where is that delineation? Because at the end of the day, an application being delivered in a browser isn't all that different from an application being delivered, you know, sort of in a, you know, in the context of mobile handset, you know, apart from obviously the UI considerations. You know, you have logic, you have, you know, data is persisted, and you have a front end. You know, how you present those things is, I don't want to say academic, but, you know, the differences are less clear than we might otherwise prefer.
Got it.
Yeah, the translation from academic to real world is exactly why we have a business opportunity.
There's money in confusion, right?
There is. I think really, whether or not it's like the likes of StackMob or Parse or like the Microsoft offering, or a traditional platform service like Roku or EngineYard, et cetera, it depends on where the center of gravity of your architecture is. Some apps are mobile clients, like online banking, right? And there's going to be so much more logic on the server. And so, like, you know, a server-centric PaaS makes more sense in that case. And then there's, like, you know, the other end is like a game where you want to store high scores and you compete with your friends, and then just something that's very lightweight in the server. It makes sense. And I think there will be, like, many PaaSes depending on the type of app you're building, and that's okay.
And some people think that the whole IaaS, PaaS thing is going to just kind of glom together. My final question is anyone, to your knowledge, building desktop applications anymore, per se?
I mean, anyone's a big question, right? I mean, certainly there are people who still build applications for the Mac, and some of them make, you know, some reasonable money doing that. But in general, no. You know, the primary sort of delivery mechanism is either a browser or handset.
You know, but I was thinking about that when you first asked me that question, and I was about like an absolute no, but then I thought, well, you know, I fired up HipChat, and it is so much better as a quote native app or a desktop app than it is in the browser. So it's a mobile web, and it has, you know, there's a case for when you want it on your desktop, and there are going to be apps of that nature, and they tend to be in the communications and collaboration space, or anything where you need just instant responsiveness, chat apps, things of that nature. So there's an opportunity there, but of course it can't be like, you know, there are no pure desktop app business opportunities, in my opinion.
Right, I think that Microsoft is even leading with Office 365
Exactly.
versus Office
Exactly.
now. I think, I actually don't know that. Anyway, we're out of time. Thank you very much. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Actually, Barb, you're 19 seconds early. Very impressive. Get a special reward for that. All right, well, we've had basically every iconic firm cross the stage over the last 36 hours or whatever. Amazon, Facebook, Rackspace,